We welcome you, sir. Today's discussion will focus on Professor Raghunathan's book, Irrationally Rational, 10 Nobel laureates who script the story of behavioral economics. Without further ado, let's start the discussion, sir. So, in the preface of your book, you explain why you decided to write this book. For those of us who haven't read it yet, could you please elaborate on this?
Thank you for him. Thank you very much for having me over. It's a pleasure to be in this session. And thanks to your university and the center as well. Yes, this book, Irrationally Rational, is my take on the kind of work that several Nobel laureates have done in converting the old neoclassical economics more and more in the direction of behavioral economics. I could give a couple of examples as a setting to start off. For example, supposing both you and I have a flight to catch, and we are both going to the airport together, and our flight is at 8 o'clock in the evening. And supposing I am going to Delhi and you are going to Calcutta. We both take the same cab because the flight is at 8 o'clock. And let us assume that we are both based in Bangalore. And the Bangalore traffic is, how bad it is.
Yeah, it's
and
deadly.
there's only one long road leading to the airport. And we find a traffic jam on the way, which is a very rare kind, which happens probably once in 40 years or 50 years. And we find that we are both stuck in the traffic jam. We can't go back because there is traffic built up behind us. We both reach the airport almost 4 hours late. So we reach the airport at some 12 o'clock in the night. We are both frustrated. We are on the traffic for 3-4 hours. But when we reach the airport, I am told, well, sir, your flight left at 8 o'clock. So there's no way there's nothing you can do about it. You are told that, oh my God, your flight actually left only 10 minutes ago. You just missed it. Had you been 10 minutes early, you could have caught the flight. Now, neoclassical economics will tell us that the situation for both of us is identical. The cost of the extra ticket that we may have to pay, the fact that we have to go back to the city or go to a hotel and check out in the night till next morning, the costs are all fairly identical. And yet, you who missed the flight by 10 minutes feel much worse compared to me who lost the flight by a 4-hour as expected margin. Now, there is already something here which is disturbing, in the sense which is something which has nothing to do with economics, but more like, oh my God, I missed it just by 10 minutes. So this kind of behavioral intervention in a matter which is otherwise purely economics related, we are already beginning to see is raising its head, which neoclassical economics would have said both of us should feel equal level of regret. But behavioral economics tells us that Farheen will feel much higher regret than Raghu. Or let me give yet another example. Supposing both of us have been wanting to see a particular movie for a very long time. Okay. Now, if we are generally asked that, okay, on the day when you are about to go to see the movie and you paid a high premium, you paid 500 rupee for an advance ticket. But on the day when we are about to leave for a movie, we find that when we reach the movie hall, the INOX or whatever, that you lost the ticket. You do not have the ticket in front of you because you lost it somewhere. Then you are asked, would you buy another ticket to buy another ticket to see the movie.
Hmm.
More likely, or a greater percentage of people in a similar situation are likely to say no. The movie was worth 500 rupee, but not worth 1000 rupee. I'm not going to pay another 500 rupee to see the movie.
Hmm.
On the other hand, supposing just when you're going to see the movie, you find that you've lost 500 rupee in cash, but you don't have an advance ticket. You're just going to buy a ticket. When you go
Hmm.
to the movie hall, you find you lost 100 rupee in cash. Are you likely to see the movie? More percentage of people are likely to say yes, we will see the movie, because losing the money was on a general account. It had nothing to do with the movie itself.
Hmm.
Neoclassical economics will tell you that in both cases your losses are the same.
Hmm.
But in reality, if you lost cash, you say you're more likely to see the movie. But if you had lost the advance ticket, you're less likely to see the movie, even though the economics of both the situations are identical. Your loss is 500. Now, obviously, in your mental accounting, one was, when you lose a ticket, it is chalked up to the ticket account. So you don't want to spend another 500. But
Hmm.
when you lose 500 rupee in cash, that loss is on cash account. Okay. Now, that's the kind of an intervention that behavioral economics keeps making in a variety of situations. Now, this is the kind of work that behavioral economists, starting from about 1960s and 70s and so on, earlier psychology and economics were viewed very, very differently. So, conventional economics has some inbuilt assumptions,
Hmm.
which we call as neoclassical economics. The
Hmm.
assumptions that it makes are somewhat very intuitive. For example, more is always preferred to less when it comes to something like gains. More profit is better than less profit. More money received is better than less money received, and so on. And similarly, higher risk is avoidable to lower risk, what we call as risk aversion.
Hmm.
Now, this is obviously intuitively understandable that you prefer more gains to less gains and less pains to more pains. That's why even children, if you ask them to take a bitter medicine, they will say no. But if you give them an eclair as a compensation, they say yes, I'm willing to
Hmm.
have that. But if you ask them to take 2 spoons of medicines, then they want yet another or more toffee. Okay.
Hmm.
So, which means that even little children are risk averse, because for every incremental unit of additional risk, they want higher compensation. And then there is the diminishing utility. For
Hmm.
example, uh, if you give them one more spoon of medicine, just giving them one more toffee is not enough. They want two toffees probably,
Hmm.
because the utility of the additional award is decreasing. So there is a diminishing utility.
Hmm.
Now, in other words, the conventional economists believe that all of us are utility maximizers. We want a package of the gain and the pain in
Hmm.
such a way that we maximize the utility that we perceive in it. Okay. In this sense, the neoclassical economics always talks in terms of what is utility maximization.
Hmm.
Now, utility maximization also assumes, for example, 4 rules like cancellation, substitution, transitivity, and dominance, about which I will come to later.
Hmm.
But fact is that somebody called Herbert Simon, who did some very early work in the field of economics, found repeatedly that look, the assumptions that neoclassical economics makes is that we are all rational human beings. We all do computations on all the data available. We have all the options available, and we choose
Hmm.
the best option out of it. Now, in reality, all the information is not available to us. If you're trying to choose, let us say, buying a car, you don't have information on all the cars. And even
True.
if you have information on all the cars, your ability to research all of them is not quite the same as somebody else. For example, a corporate may have so much more information available, but as an individual, the information available to us is much less.
Hmm.
In other words, our rationality is a bounded rationality. It is not an infinite rationality.
Hmm.
So the moment it's bounded rationality, my bound may be different from your bound. In Bombay city, the information available may be very different from a small village. So a
Hmm.
car buyer in a village has more bounded rationality than what may be available in the city of Bombay or Bangalore. In other words, this is where Herbert Simon started saying that, look, the assumption made by classical economists that we all work with bounded rationality was not quite correct.
Hmm.
Similarly, his subsequent scholar who worked in the area of behavioral economics was uh, Gary Becker, who was a hyper rationalist, who looked at things like marriages, things like prisons, things like what is the right time to have a child, for example. He
Hmm.
looked at everything from the prism of rational economics. He said you marry at a time when your utility will be maximized. Okay.
Hmm.
Similarly, you will, you know, look at crime from the lens of economics. If the risk of my being caught is very low, and if the penalty is relatively low, but the
Hmm.
payoff of the crime is very high, then I will commit that crime because I am measuring the rewards of the crime versus the risk of the crime, for
Hmm.
example. So he applied economics in practically every field. Okay. But then he found, as he was beginning to do that, that behavior was a big part of what decisions we make. After all, we are taking a decision as individuals, and
Hmm.
you cannot segregate behavior from the lens of pure economics. Now, cognition, for example, according to him, was not an enemy of rationality,
Hmm.
because the pure economists continue to say psychology is a separate field and economics is a separate field. Let us not mix the two. So, psychology is a subject that we study very differently, and the role of psychology in decision making is not treated in the same way as the role of economics in decision making. That is because economics and cognition, which is psychology, were viewed as two entirely different fields. But Gary Becker, for example, did not think so. He continued to say, for example, the role that racism plays, or caste plays, or social classes play in decision making. When you interview people, your decision is not necessarily that you will take someone whose expected salary is the lowest. Okay, because there are many other considerations that go in. Similarly, do we maximize returns or do we minimize risk? If all decisions are based only on minimum risk, then maximization of utility may or may not be the correct criteria of looking at a decision. Regret
Hmm.
minimization works very differently from utility maximization. For example, if you only want to maximize profits versus you only want to minimize losses, the corporate's behavior patterns could be very, very different, right? Now, this was the kind of work that Gary Becker was doing. In other words, over the 1950s and 60s, more and more scholars were beginning to question the fundamental working of economics. Okay. And that is when we also had people like George Akerlof, Michael Spence, and Joseph Stiglitz, who all talked about signaling effect. What was called the market for lemons when it came to the second-hand cars market. Supposing you're trying to sell a second-hand car. Now, the seller has much more information on their car than the buyer has. You don't know whether the car has met with an accident or not. You don't know whether that car is a gas guzzler and that is why the person is trying to sell the car. But the seller has all that information. So this kind of an information asymmetry, what effect does it have on the final price that the car may actually command? Now, these are questions which are no longer pure economics. This is a question of your information asymmetry that you have. Similarly, if you're buying an insurance, you know that you're a bad driver, but the insurance agent does not know that. So, what can he do to minimize this information asymmetry and make you pay a higher premium towards the insurance? Now, supposing he creates a scheme where, what you call as higher deductibles for you, that you have to pay 40%. Only the remaining will be paid by the insurance company. Okay. Now they will increase the deductibles because they don't know whether you are a good driver or a bad driver. But if you are a very good driver, you will avoid an insurance policy where the deductible is much higher. Because you say, why should I pay 40%? I am a good driver, I am a safe driver. So the younger people will be willing to pay, who probably drive a little more rashly than the older people, let us say a 60-year-old. So their willingness to pay insurance premiums will be very different from those who are much younger. In other words, a whole lot of variables which have nothing to do with pure economics do play a role in purely economic decisions. And we will see some examples of those as we go along. Now, these are the kinds of differences which first and foremost, in a more experimental sense, Kahneman and Tversky came into in the late 70s. Okay. Now, already the people that I named earlier, for example, George Akerlof, Spence, and Stiglitz, they got their Nobel Prize in 2001. Before that, George Becker got it in 1992. And before that, of course, Herbert Simon got it in 1978. Now, as the broad picture of economics started gradually changing from pure numbers to behavior thrown in, this is when both Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they were both pure psychologists. Though Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002, the fact is they were not economists at all. They were both psychologists in the university in Israel. But they started looking at a whole lot of things. For example, the very well-known assumptions in economics talk about the rules of cancellation, the rules of substitution, the rules of transitivity, and the rules of dominance. So let us look at what do these mean. Okay, this is the conventional economics, which Kahneman and Tversky in their work of prospect theory showed is not true. For example, I ask a simple question. If I prefer, let us say, an apple plus peach over an apple plus orange, it obviously means I prefer peach to oranges. The apple is common. This is called the rule of cancellation. The apple goes out. So apple plus peach is better than apple plus orange, means peaches are better than oranges because the apple was a common choice. Similarly, rules of substitution. If I prefer apple to oranges, that means I'll prefer 50% chance of receiving an apple to 50% chance of receiving an orange, which is again very intuitively simple to understand. And this is what the economists assume, that our decision making assumes that if I prefer an apple to an orange, I'll prefer 50% chance of an apple to 50% chance of orange, which is called the rule of substitution. Similarly, there's the rule of transitivity. If I prefer apples to oranges and oranges to peaches, that means I'll prefer apple to peaches. Apple is better than oranges. Oranges are better than peaches, which means apples will be better than peaches. It's called the rule of transitivity. Correct? And finally, the rule of dominance. If I prefer apple, supposing I compare apples and peaches on taste, nutrients, glycemic index, roughage, and firmness. So there are 5 parameters on which I am comparing apples with peaches. Now, on 4 parameters out of these, the 2 are exactly the same. I have no preference of one over the other. But when it comes to taste, I prefer apple to peaches. So there are totally 5 parameters. On 4 parameters, I prefer, the 2 are exactly equal. But on 1 parameter, I find apples are better than peaches. That will mean I will always prefer apple to peaches. Now, this is called the rule of dominance. So there is the rule of cancellation, rule of substitution, rule of transitivity, and rule of dominance. Now, all of these are very intuitive. I'm sure no reasonable person will say that this is not right. These are all rational. Any rational person, we would assume, or neoclassical economics assumes, that people, when they take decisions, this is the basis. These are the 4 rules they apply about rationality. But prospect theory showed that all these rules are violated when we take a lot of decisions on a day-to-day basis. Now, this was highly disturbing because a lot of research has gone into rationality to a point where even rats are supposed to be rational animals. For example, if you give rats, supposing you train them to press some levers to get, let us say, some food, or press some levers to get some water. And supposing every day you give them a total of 20 presses, so they can use some of the presses to get food and some presses will get them water. So 2 levers, one may be red, one may be green. Green is for water, red is for food. And if they press 3 times, they'll get a pellet of food. If they press 2 times, they'll get a dosage of water in their little pan. Now, the total number of presses is like the money that they have, which they can spend either on food or on water or on a combination. It seems within a few presses, the rats learn to maximize their personal utility. That they will have a nice trade-off between one and the other. The rule of dominance will apply, the rule of substitution will apply, they will, for a better food, they'll be willing to, spend more on better food than on less food and so on. So a whole lot of experimentation has shown that even rats are utility maximizers. And therefore, to say human beings are not utility maximizers, they found it very difficult to accept. That is why economics was always very rigid on utility maximization. But the behavioralists like Kahneman and Tversky, when they came into the studies, they said, look, human beings are not rats. A rat may be a utility maximizer, but human beings think a lot more and very unlike rats. And for them, a whole lot of things matter. And that is where they say, for example, they gave a test question to 2 sets of doctors who were drawn from a similar population, which means both doctors were similar in every respect. One of them is asked that, look, a COVID is going to hit a city in a big way and 600 people are expected to die. If we develop vaccine A and give that to the people, 200 people are likely to be saved. But if we give vaccine B, there is a 2/3 chance that nobody will be saved, and there's a 1/3 chance that 600 will be saved. Only 1/3 chance that 600 will be saved. So, do you prefer vaccine A or vaccine B? So, I repeat, vaccine A, the overall COVID is likely to kill 600 people. If vaccine A is used, 200 are certain to be saved. If vaccine B is used, there's a 2/3 chance that nobody will be saved, and there's a 1/3 chance that 600 will be saved. So, which vaccine will you prefer? A lot of people preferred vaccine A over vaccine B, because vaccine A was saving 200 people with certainty. So, there was risk aversion. They did not want risk, they wanted to save people. Now, another set of doctors who were very similar to the previous one were given two options. They said, look, if we use vaccine C, 400 will die when the COVID hits. If we use vaccine D, there's a 2/3 chance that 600 will die, and there's a 1/3 chance that nobody will die. I repeat, vaccine C will ensure that if you give, 400 people will die. Vaccine D, if used, there is a 2/3 chance that 600 will die, and 1/3 chance that nobody will die. Now, a greater number of doctors prefer D over vaccine C, because in vaccine C, 400 people were going to die, whereas in the vaccine D, there was a chance, for example, 2/3 chance that 600 will die, and only 1/3 chance that nobody will die. So they accepted the deaths with uncertainty. So when it's a bad news, we don't mind accepting uncertainty. Actually, the two options are identical to the two options earlier, except that one is framed in terms of life, other is framed in terms of death. Now, obviously, there is an implication. If you are the CEO of, let us say, a insurance company, should you be selling insurance as a death aversion or a life-giving mechanism? So, which means the same information, depending on how it is presented, makes a difference to the decision maker. Whereas neoclassical economics will say that you are so rational that you will immediately see through both options as being identical and make the same decision. But in reality, when you offer questions like this, even see, if you assume that doctors are irrational beings, then there's a bigger problem. How do we even go to a doctor tomorrow?
True.
Now, it turns out that in reality, people, it's one thing to say that we assume people behave rationally. It's another thing to see how rational people actually behave. So doctors who we assume are rational people are actually behaving such that their choices are different depending on how a question is framed. And that's not the only one. For example, if you get some lottery, supposing you got 1 lakh rupee in lottery money, versus 1 lakh rupee as a part of your salary, which of the two are you more likely to spend for a vacation?
Of course, the lottery one.
The lottery one. Because easy come, easy go in our mindset. Because lottery money you treat as a different kind of a money. It just came in, so you're willing to blow it. But salary is a serious thing. It's meant for running the house. You don't want to blow it. Correct? But the fact is, money is money. It doesn't matter what color the money has. I mean, whether it came via lottery or via salary, money is exactly money. Your wealth is now higher by 1 lakh rupees. So why should it make a difference? Because the mental accounting, one is easy come, easy go. Another is, oh my God, hard-earned money. So you treat them differently because you have a mental accounting, which is at work.
Definitely.
If you remember our earlier example of going for a play, in one case you said it was a movie account. Movie
Hmm.
is good enough for 500 rupees, but not for 1000 rupees.
Hmm.
But in the other case, the loss was on a general loss account. We lose money on 100 things. That has nothing to
Hmm.
do with the movie. So you are putting them in two different mental accounts. Pure economics will say both of them are the real loss account. But mental accounting has its own way of looking at. That is why you may be saving money for a house
Hmm.
and you have saved 25 lakh rupee for a house. Your target is 50 lakhs. You are still saving for it. But in the meanwhile, if you want a car, you go for a car loan.
Hmm.
You don't spend out of that 25 lakh.
Hmm. Hmm.
The fact is, you could have taken the same money from the 25 lakh and even if you take a loan, you have to repay the loan. That
Hmm.
money could
Hmm.
have gone into your house saving kitty.
True.
In your mind, when it is a house saving, you feel the compulsion to put in the money. Similarly,
So, may I just
once if
interrupt?
it's difficult, you may not contribute. But if it is a bank loan, there's a greater discipline to continue to pay the money. So you treat the loan account of the car different from the account of the housing that you are saving for. So one can give any number of examples. You will not sell some shares for a vacation. But if you received a dividend check, you will blow it on the vacation.
Let me pose you another question in that realm. Uh, these are one of the most interesting thing about your book is that not many there are a lot of books that do the sort of portray the history of how behavior economics is, but what your book does unique is that you portray Indian examples of these theories throughout the book. And the unique ones, for example, the Mumbai trains ticketless insurers, to the banking, India's banking sector, and different fictions that exist in the system. So, could you say how, from your experience, how differently do Indians make economic decisions for compared to, say, the weird, in the weird context, being the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic? And a brief answer, sir.
Well, people are essentially people, you know,
Hmm.
and yes, the cultural, social context can make a difference, but most people are typically people, and Indians have no reason to be particularly different from anybody else. And yet,
Hmm.
yes, we do, because of the socio-cultural impact, we do see that people's behavior is somewhat different. For example, let me give you an
Hmm.
example. Supposing in your location where
Hmm.
you live in a building where there is a shop right on the first floor.
Hmm.
Supposing the truckers in your city are all on strike, and
Hmm.
therefore vegetables are difficult to reach the retailer. Okay.
Hmm.
And your retailer has increased the prices by 40%. The
Hmm.
shopkeeper under your apartment has increased the prices by 40%.
Hmm.
But there is another one 10 minutes away. If you walk 10 minutes, there's another shop. He has not raised the prices because, according to him, he had bought the vegetables before the trucker's price hike.
Hmm.
So he's selling it at the same price, whereas
Hmm.
the one under your apartment is selling it for 40% higher. Now, if you
Hmm.
ask a question in India to a lot
Hmm.
of people, where would you go and buy the vegetables from? The one who's right downstairs but charging 40% more,
Hmm.
or the one who is 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away, and whom you got to walk to, but who has not raised his prices? A lot of people in India, or a greater percentage of Indians, will say, look, I will try to compare what will it
Hmm.
cost me to take an auto and go there. And if I
Hmm.
include that price, if that turns out to be higher, I will prefer to buy it from the same guy who is under my
Hmm.
apartment. And it's so much more convenient to buy it
Hmm.
from here. Whereas elsewhere, most people would say, I would prefer to walk 10 minutes away just to punish this guy. I don't mind the effort of 15 minutes going away because I want to punish this guy who has raised his prices unfairly. Correct? So unfairness comes into play. Or take another example. Supposing two people are, you pose a question to an Indian and a foreigner. More often than not, what the answers are likely to be. The question is, two of us are in a beach, and one of us wants to drink a Coke. And your friend is going to go to the main road, which is about 200 meters away, and going to buy a can of Coke. There are two shops there. One is an air-conditioned shop, proper restaurant. The other is a Coca, a small little vendor. So your friend says that, look, one guy is charging, the restaurant is charging a much higher price than the Coca. The Coca is selling it for 40 rupees, but the restaurant is selling for 120 rupees. Right? Now, supposing there is only a air-conditioned restaurant, the price will be 120. And you are asked, will you drink the Coke? You may say yes or you may say no, depending on whether you can afford 120 or not. The other one is 40 rupees. Okay. But in your mind, you will say that, look, in the case of the 120 rupee price, has an air conditioner to run. It's a regular restaurant. Normally, they do charge much higher. So it's okay. It's fair on his part. But if the Coca was trying to charge you 120 rupees, you will say no. He has no business charging 120 rupees because he has no overheads. He should charge only 40. So he is being unfair in charging 120. So I will say no. I may not say no to the air-conditioned restaurant, but I may say no to the Coca for charging 120 rupees. But for me, the product is the same. It is a packed product. There is no hygiene issue. It's coming in a can. Okay. But I now superimpose the unfairness. Now, this unfairness will be more apparent in the international respondents than it is in India. Indian respondents are very more rational in that sense. Whereas fairness plays a much greater role with the international audience. So in India, we are not willing to pay for an unfairness. Where people are willing to pay for the unfairness. I will rather go without Coke than reward an unfair guy. In India, we will say, no, if that is the only option, I will pay. What else can I do? So there are these little differences that one tends to notice in the kind of, but of course, I will not call them a research response. These are more anecdotal responses because research response has to be far more serious. But I'll give some examples of, many of these can also come under the nudge, which was Thaler's, lot of work by Thaler has been done under nudge. For example, you will find as much in India as anywhere else. For example, often these days one finds in the urinals, they will put a mark in the middle. The idea is that people have an automatic tendency to aim at the thing so that you don't splash out. Right? Now, this nudge is very international. Now, whether it is an Indian audience or an international audience, the nudge works the same way. Similarly, which another very interesting nudge in traffic, which has not been tried in India, but has been tried in a different way, which I'll come to, is, for example, overseas, you notice wherever there are bends, if people don't automatically slow down, of course there will be signages, but they'll also put some of these, these dotted lines in the middle of the roads closer to each other. So that when you're taking a turn, it appears you're going very fast. Because the
optical illusion.
further together, the illusion will be that you're going very fast. So you tend to brake. So it's a nudge in a way. In India, in Bangalore, for example, you find in many traffic signals, they put mannequins of policemen.
Hmm.
Mannequins dressed as a policeman kept in the center of a crossing in some
This,
place.
hmm.
Now,
These
because
are
as
some
you're
amazing.
driving, there's a nudge. You feel, oh my God, there's a
Hmm.
police.
Hmm.
Even when you know it's a mannequin, you automatically tend to slow down. Okay. So nudges are a good example of how they work anywhere in the world. Of course, the nature of nudges may be a little different because in India
Hmm.
roads are not even marked. So the dotted line thing is irrelevant because half our single roads are not even marked anywhere. And even if they are marked, no one cares about the lines. We often think the line is meant for us to take it in the middle of the car and not keeping the lanes and so on.
Hmm.
Those are the cultural differences. But similarly, organ donations.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, organ donations often, whether it is an opt-in or opt-out. Supposing you get a letter and we say, if we don't hear from you, we will
Hmm.
assume that you are not giving a donation of your organ.
Hmm.
Afterwards says, if we don't hear from you, we will automatically assume that you are giving a donation. Okay,
Hmm.
so the responses will look very, very different. So how you frame, because of the framing effect, you
Hmm.
can use it for a nudge. And marketeers often use it against your interest. A lot of Indians fall for it.
So within this context, sir, I just wanted to ask you. So as you said, in India, in different ways and in different sectors, the application of behavioral science or behavioral economic theories have been sort of proliferating. For example, HDFC Bank has been applying, they have a separate division for behavior science. Companies like Swiggy does. And even in Indian public sector, government also has different nudge units across states. So, how do you see this sort of increase of behavior economics within India? Do you see any opportunities or challenges? Could you say something about this?
Not a you see,
Hmm.
even the government of India at one stage was talking about setting up a nudge department, which makes a lot of sense. For example, taxes. How do you, in India, it's very well known that barely 2.5 to 3% Indians pay taxes. Okay. Now, what can we do to increase the percentage of people paying taxes?
Hmm.
Now, of course, part of it has nothing to do with nudging. You simply have to, the enforcement directorate has to be very firm with people
Hmm.
who evade taxes and so on. But
Hmm.
apart from that, supposing I receive a letter from the tax authorities
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
90% of the people in your neighborhood have already paid taxes,
Hmm.
you are delayed. If you receive a letter like this versus you receive nothing from the tax authorities, where are the chances higher that you will quickly expedite your tax payment if you receive that letter? So that letter is a nudge.
Hmm.
Okay. So a nudge telling you that 90% people have already paid will give a sense of urgency to you so that before the end of July, you also end up paying your taxes.
Hmm.
So nudge can play a very, very important role. Okay. Similarly, seat belts. You want to
Hmm.
increase people wearing seat belts. Now, supposing all the two-wheeler holders in India, very often they carry the helmets on the side of the vehicle, and if they see a cop, they put it on,
Hmm.
without even putting on the straps. Because we
Yeah.
believe, helmets are not necessary or seat
Hmm.
belts are not necessary in a car.
Hmm.
Okay, so you want to increase the people's habit of wearing seat belts or helmets for two
Hmm.
wheelers or seat belts for the car owners. If you repeat, supposing there's a camera fixed which catches your picture and sends you an automated mail which says you are not wearing a seat belt on this day or you are not wearing a helmet on this day, and
Hmm.
on that day in your city 125 people met with an accident.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, if you receive that letter, the chances that next time you'll wear a seat belt or a helmet is much higher. So it's a nudge, okay, versus doing nothing. If no letter is received, you will be going on with your normal habit. But if a nudge comes to you, you don't need to fine. Supposing the city doesn't, if they want to fine, even better, because it's a greater resistance. Regulation always helps. But even if you're not, for political reasons and so on, you don't want to fine everybody, but at least nudge them, you can send them letters of that kind saying that on this day, so many people died. So next day, please wear your seatbelt or your helmet. This is again a kind of a nudge. Or you want people to eat more healthy food, because in India, health is a big issue. Women's health, child mortality, all of these are related to nutrition. Okay. Now, supposing you say that shops will keep the healthy food in the front and potato chips and all will be kept at the non-visible area. That's a nudge for healthy food. And part of it can be self-motivation. Shopkeepers, if they are also part of, supposing you create a group of healthy food proponents, they will tend to put the healthy food on the counter and non-healthy food under the vision, so that you have to ask for it. Okay. Now, so where you place the healthy food can make a big difference. Okay. Similarly, food wastage in restaurants. Supposing as a policy, the government of India wants to reduce the food wastage. What can you do? If the plate sizes are reduced, the helping size reduces. If you take a big plate, you want to fill up 1/3 of the plate with the food, let us say. So if it's a smaller plate, you still tend to fill 1/3 of the place. So smaller plates, it has been noticed that people tend to eat a little less than if the plates are much larger. So therefore, restaurants can start using smaller plates to reduce the food wastage. You don't need to tell people to eat less, but they automatically eat more healthy if the plate size is smaller, because the helping size is smaller. Otherwise, with larger plates, people take a larger helping and then leave a lot of food because they eat much less and they serve themselves much more than what they actually are likely to. Okay. So nudges are possible in saving food. Now, these are all the possibilities that any nudge unit can use.
But so isn't there, so as you mentioned within these examples, there's a slight difference between manipulation as well as this line between helpful nudging. So within Indian context, how do you see we can sort of handle this difference responsibly? Is there any examples you could say
Yes.
would be helpful?
Manipulation implies using it for a wrong end. Like a lot of IT frauds, they manipulate you. They're nudges. When someone calls you and says, you have won a lottery, please click on this link. The availability of the link itself is a nudge for you to click on it. It is a nudge, but it's manipulative. Okay. So when used for a wrong end, nudge is manipulation. A marketer says, you pay 200 rupees now, and 1 month later, a marketer says you pay 200 rupees now for a magazine subscription. And 1 month later, if you write to us saying that you don't want the subscription, we will return your 200 rupees. So that is one kind. Another is, if you don't write to us anything at all, we will assume that every month you are willing to deduct 200 rupees from your account. Same thing as opt-in and opt-out. If you don't respond, we will assume that you are a buyer. If you don't respond, we will assume that you are not a buyer. Correct? Now there is a nudge here, but the marketeer is obviously trying to say that if you don't respond, I will automatically assume that it's a repeated buy. No, that is
Hmm.
against your interest. You should not really be falling for it. You have to be careful. In marketing, a lot of nudging is manipulative. You see, otherwise, Shah Rukh Khan saying Baiju Foundation is a great education. Today, we can see what was the nature of that education. The company
Hmm.
is bankrupt. Okay.
Hmm.
So,
In this
marketers
context,
very often use nudging for manipulation.
hmm.
But a government nudge unit should be doing it for the positive end. And the intention is the difference, mainly.
Hmm. But you mentioned an interesting example within the book about how startups or companies sort of signal that they are competent or profitable
Correct.
liquidly using that they do dividends instead of capital gains. In a brief 2 minutes, since we are just reaching the end of the session.
Right. You see, when someone just tries to do financial dealings with you only on the telephone
Hmm.
versus having a huge office where you go, they have a whole floor in a very expensive area. You,
Hmm.
you know that these people have invested money. They are not likely to disappear overnight. Whereas someone in a small, pokey little office, if you go for opening a fixed deposit, it's a
Hmm.
pokey little office. It does not give you the confidence to put in 5 lakh rupee in the FD. But if
Hmm.
it's a fancy big office, that means those people have invested heavy amount of money, and
Hmm.
so it's a signal that they
Hmm.
are not likely to be an overnight operator because they have spent so much money. Of course,
Hmm.
whether it is ILFS or Divan Housing have also been into fraud with all the fancy big offices. But the
Hmm.
probability is much lower that someone who has invested that big money for a big office would have had
Hmm.
to either borrow from a
Hmm.
bank. Bank should have done their due diligence before lending money, or
Hmm.
they have invested their own money for a big fancy office. Is a signal that look, we are here for the long haul.
Hmm.
Second-hand car dealer, same thing.
Hmm.
Some second-hand car dealer just sells the cars by parking them on the wayside versus having a big showroom. Which of
Hmm.
the two are you more likely to have faith in? The one
Hmm.
who has a big showroom, because he is
Of course.
unlikely to disappear overnight.
Hmm.
Whereas the guy who sells the second-hand shops on the side of the road, even though
Hmm.
his cars may be cheaper because he has no overhead, you would
Hmm.
rather buy it from a proper shop because you
Hmm.
expect him to be there for the longer haul. So these are the kinds of signals that these marketeers send you to know
Hmm.
that they are existing there for the long haul. So these are some
Hmm.
examples. I mean, one can give
Hmm.
any number of examples for a whole day. On any one of your questions, I can spend a whole day talking. But
Definitely.
basically, these are the examples of signaling.
So within this, let me co-join two questions that I have. Uh, there, within India, especially post to 2020, you say that behavior economics has streamlined all globally, but within India, there is this sort of disconnect where we know that these sort of insights exist from behavior economics, and yet the academia, I, as a student of economics post 2020, I did not receive any teaching about the subject within my course. And that says something about how our economics is taught in India. And the other question, do you have any, why is it not well represented? The first question. And the second is there
No,
a way
sorry.
to bridge this?
What is the first question? Repeat it again, please.
My first question to you is that how, even though we know that behavior economics has been mainstream post 2020, after 3 decades of it,
You're
how
saying
is
it's
it?
still not there in India as much.
Yes, yes. And the second question is, with these sort of theories around even an application within India has sort of proliferated, how come that there is still a gap between the research that we do and the practicing that these executives are doing on ground, whether be it in public sector or in the private sector? Briefly, so sorry. I
Okay.
know this is a very hard question to answer.
No, not a problem. I understand what your question is. You see,
Hmm.
firstly, there is a larger issue, which is there is always a gap between academics and practitioners.
Hmm.
There is always a gap between theory and practice. Okay.
Hmm.
Theoreticians are trying to explain practice. And in
Hmm.
trying to explain that practice, the neoclassical economists made certain assumptions. In trying to explain practice, the
Hmm.
behavioral economists studied the actual practice and came up with different implications. Okay.
Hmm.
So the neoclassical economists said the practitioners make their decision like this.
Hmm.
Behavioral economists came on the scene with researchers
Hmm.
and showed that no, they don't behave like this, they behave like this, which was a different set of parameters. Now, most of the research is done in the Western world, not in India. Much of the research in behavioral economics and even the subjects of the behavioral economics are not Indians, they are outside India. And if an American or an Israelite is doing the research, obviously their examples will be more relevant to their countries. Now, India has in general not been a researching country. Not
Hmm.
only in the Indian academia, even in the Indian industry, we only follow whatever has been done elsewhere and try to make use of it here. Even automobiles, the kind of developments that you see, or electronics, or computers, or in any field,
Hmm.
India lags behind the rest of the world when it comes to R&D. Our
Hmm.
spend on research is very, very small. So the gap between academics and practitioners in India tends to be much larger
Hmm.
than what it is in the Western or more developed world. In the developed world, also, there is a gap between research and practice. But the gap, they try to minimize that gap. In India, that gap remains fairly large. Therefore, even the research results of what we see
Hmm.
from behavioral economics are not so much based on the Indian experiences.
Hmm.
In fact, now it is left to a lot of researchers in India to try and build the gap in theory of behavioral economics between the developed countries and Indian context. So
Hmm.
we need a lot more research papers which take Indian subjects and in the Indian context. But of course, at one level, yes, we need more of that research. At another level, if we say medicines which work well on a rat can, or rabbits can be applied to human beings, we can
Hmm.
also say the behavioral economics research which applies to the American citizens will also apply to human beings in India. So,
Hmm.
we can do that. But at the same time, it will help a lot if Indian economists also start reading more of the behavioral economics literature. And the fact is, even in pure economics, pure research in India is very little.
Hmm.
So the kind of gaps that we talked about, neoclassical economists versus behavioral economists, in Indian research papers, that there's very little of literature of
Hmm.
serious research, even in economics, leave
Hmm.
alone behavioral economics. So I
Hmm.
think we have a long way to go, which is more about our culture and take on research in general. So I do believe that Indian academia needs to be more research oriented. We are more teaching oriented. We take what is available from the Western world and we try to teach in India. Yes, some of the serious business schools like ISB or IIMs may be doing a little bit of that kind of research, but we
Hmm.
have a long way to go.
That's. Thank you so much for shedding a light on the behavior economics and its context, especially in India. Thank you so much for taking your time for our session and elaborately answering such with unique insights from the book. Um, and if I may
I
just
hope
ask you
the
last.
readers will read the book.
Yes, sir. We hope as well. And if you have any last words to students or people pursuing this field, this subject within India, what advice would you give them? Just
I
last
would
question.
say you read this book
This one,
because
sir.
not because I have written it, but because it genuinely encapsulates much of what behavioral economics has to say and what
Mm,
people have done, and with a lot of examples, and some examples even in the Indian context. But if you don't even read the book, merely by listening to a small TED talk like thing, or articles, will
mm,
not make you an expert. Okay, so if you want to truly understand decision making in general, decision making tomorrow as an executive, when you go into your careers and so forth, life will be increasingly be getting complex, and having a good understanding of human beings and how they make decisions will help you make better decisions. That's my only parting advice.
thank you so much, sir.
All the best, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you for joining us once again, sir. To
Good
all,
day. I wish you all the
thank
very
you,
best
sir.
in your lives and careers. Best of
Thank you,
luck.
sir.